Today we're going to look at a strengthen question. As always, I had to redact brief portions of this question because of copyright. If you'd like to see the full official question as it appears in the official guide, go ahead and click the GMATClub link to the question in the description box and come back when you're ready. All right, so like all CR question types, it's incredibly important that we do not look at these answer choices and don't get distracted by them until we fully understand the argument and have come up with the prediction. So just to make sure that we are behaving, I'm going to cover up those answer choices. As always with CR, we're going to start with the question stem. You need to figure out what kind of CR you're looking at so that you know essentially what to look for in the answer choices. So the first thing we'll do is go here. Which of the following, if true, does most to justify the analyst's expectation? So it might be confusing at first to understand what question type this is, but the word justify kind of gives it away. If you're justifying the expectation, and if there's a group of people and they have an expectation for the future, like it's almost like they're making some sort of prediction or prophecy, right? And if we're supposed to justify that, well, then we're strengthening it. So this is a strengthen question. So if I was doing this for the first time, I would write strengthen on my scratch paper. So for strengthen questions, before we can strengthen a conclusion, we need to understand what the conclusion is. So let's take a look. Prolonged spells of hot, dry weather typically reduce a vineyard's yield because the grapes stay relatively small. Okay, period. So let's just take that chunk. So what's the situation here? All right, well, we've got some hot weather. Maybe I'll draw a little sun. And the yield, right? The grapes are small. So maybe I'll draw like a little grape. Just a little bunch of grapes. Really bad drawing, but that's okay, right? Maybe I'll put a little sad face next to them because they're very small. So it's hot, it makes the grapes small, so they don't yield as much. Great, that's one of the premises. In years with such weather, wine producers can make only a relatively small quantity of wine. Okay, so that makes sense. So it's hot, the grapes are small, and therefore we're not making as much wine. It's my little wine bottle. Here, it has a label on it. It's a Pinot Noir. Nonetheless, in regions where wine producers generally grow their own grapes, analysts typically expect a long, hot, dry spell late in the growing season to result in increased revenues for local wine producers. Interesting, right? So here we've got our analysts that we remember from our question stem, right? Which of the following does most to justify the expectation? So what is their expectation? It's that they expect that this hot spell, this sun, late in the growing season will give an increased revenue. So we're here to ask why. Why is that? Why would all this sun late in the growing season actually lead to more money? I don't know why I did 3 lines. That's weird. Why would it actually lead to more money? Because there's a bit of a paradox, right? It seems like the yield is smaller. So why, if we have fewer bottles of my delicious Pinot Noir, do we have more money? It feels a little bit like a paradox. So I suppose you could sort of think of it in those terms as well, right? It's very unusual. So prediction, what would justify the expectation? Well, something that would explain why, because we're going to have less wine when it's hot, that we're somehow going to make more money. Why is that the situation? So essentially, this is what we're here to strengthen. Why do we have more money when there's less wine? All right. The correct answer is going to have to, justify that. So let's take a look at them. A says the lower a vineyard's yield, the less labor it requires to harvest. Okay, but labor has to do with cost, right? It doesn't have anything to do with the revenue. So that might say, okay, well, they'll have fewer costs, so maybe overall their profits would be higher, but this specifically says increased revenues, right? And revenues is the money coming in. So that I think is sort of an important idea, like revenue, profit, cost, differentiating those 3 things, which fair enough, right? If you're taking the GMAT, if you're going to business school, they expect you to understand those concepts. B, long, hot, dry spells at the beginning of the grape growing season are rare, but they can have a devastating effect on a vineyard's yield. Well, what's weird about this is they say the beginning of the grape growing season, and this specifically said late in the growing season. So the conclusion that the analyst's expectation only has to do with the situation late in the growing season, has nothing to do with what might happen at the beginning of the growing season. So this is completely out of scope. C says grapes grown for wine production are made into wine at or near the vineyard in which they were grown. It's like, well, at or near the vineyard, okay, great. But like the relative proximity of where they're grown doesn't relate at all to why this idea of having less wine or it being hotter late in the season means that we would have more revenue. It doesn't explain that at all. When hot, dry spells are followed by heavy rains, the rains frequently destroy crops. Again, heavy rains, well, we're just not talking about rain at all. Does not relate. E, grapes that have matured in hot, dry weather make better wine than ordinary grapes. Okay, so this is very interesting because it says matured, right? And specifically the timeline they were focused on was late in the growing season, presumably when the wine would be more, mature, right? So it's saying the wines that have matured when it's hot, it makes better wine. Okay, so if the wine is better, even though there's less of it, that might explain what we said at the beginning, where less wine, more money. They're making more revenue because people are perhaps willing to pay more because even though there's less wine to sell, the wine that they do have to sell is better. And the word that I actually crossed off here is significantly better. So that's what really, really sells E. So E is our correct answer. If you have any questions, feel free to comment in the comment section below.